During World War II, the Americans were fighting a war in two theaters. American troops were deployed in the war in Europe and in the Pacific. While the American soldiers were fighting, there was a possibility of being captured by the enemy. If the Americans were to be captured, the prisoners were starved, beaten, and treated badly while in prison camps. This was apparent in both Germany and Japan.
In Germany, the prisoners were captured and taken to prison camps. The Nazis would penetrate the Allied lines looking for American troops to imprison. By the end of the war, there was around 95,000 or more American prisoners of war in Germany. When they got to the prisons, it was harsh right away, and the American soldiers were forced into small barracks to stay. The barracks were small, and the former soldiers were claustrophobic, monotonous, and hungry. The Americans in Germany were also forced to do labor if they were captured by the Nazis. In the Reich, the prisoners were forced to work in factories, mines, and many more dangerous jobs. And all the work that was done by the American prisoners was beneficial to Germany and the German effort in the war. They even had to build their own camps in some situations. In these camps, they were forced into confinement where they faced severe depression and anxiety. Although they were beaten, forced to work, and depressed, they still showed strong courage, and the American soldiers were resilient, respectable, disciplined, and they stuck together. All of this helped them to endure the punishments and torture. Some soldiers were so courageous they even planned to escape a German prison camp. To escape, the two prisoners in captivity found a paintbrush and white paint and started to paint the middle of the road until they got to the camp's gate. When they got to the gate, the Germans opened the door because they thought they were doing a job on the road and not the American prisoners in the camp. However, during the war, the same was going on in Japan. The Japanese were much more brutal to the American soldiers that were captured while fighting in the Pacific, and the conditions of these camps were much worse. Once captured, the goal of the Japanese was to obtain information from them. And this is where the torture came in. They had to try their best to get the Americans to speak. To do this, the Japanese got them super drunk and offered them French girls if they would reveal any information. Also, if this didn't work, they prevented them from sleeping for 5 days, beat them with sticks, starved them, threatened to shoot them, and the wounded got no medical attention. The treatment was so bad that it broke the rules of the 1929 Geneva Convention of Prisoners of War, and 33% of the American prisoners of war died in Japan. Also, for the Japanese benefit, they would do medical testing on the Americans. On the day that the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and the prisoners were freed, one prisoner by the last name of Smith said,
"We stood among the burning embers to view without obstruction the miles upon miles of leveled rubbish that just a few hours before had been the homes and industry of nearly 1 million people."
Thus showing the ending of the war with Japan and the freeing of the American prisoners of war in Japanese prison camps. One of the most notable of the American prisoners of war was Louis Zamperini. Louis was born and raised in Torrance, California, and grew up a delinquent child. Zamperini grew up to be an Olympic runner during the 1936 Games, and 5 years later, he found himself flying B-24s in the Pacific for the American Army. During an emergency mission, the plane in which he was flying in broke down and crashed into the ocean. This left Zamperini and 2 other crew members on a single raft for around 47 days with nothing to eat but what they could catch. On top of this, Louis and 1 other survivor were found by the Japanese while on the raft near the Marshall Islands. This saved their lives from dying out on the water, but being in the hands of the Japanese was not much better. Lewis was sent to the camp of Kwajalein Atoll, and after surviving here, he was sent to the camp of Ofuna, which was even harsher. The final location he was transferred was Naotsu, a prisoner of war camp in northern Japan. This is where he stayed until the war ended. The young Louis was subjected to an insane amount of beatings, brutal torture, and endured physical hardships no human could endure. This was because the Japanese knew he was an Olympian, and they expected him to be stronger than the rest. Also, he was one of the only prisoners to go against the Japanese direction. This is a direct example of how the Japanese did not follow the rules of how to treat prisoners, and Zamperini was awarded a Purple Heart when he returned home after explaining his encounters and experience in Japanese prison camps. Later in his life, he eventually returned to Japan to spread his word of Christianity and visit the camp in which he was held. In order to survive through the harsh times as a prisoner, the soldiers needed courage and hope. The International Red Cross Committee, assisted by the Swiss government, was responsible for providing the American prisoners of war with the motivation and hope needed. In order to do this, companies such as the Ecumenical Commission for Assistance to Prisoners of War, Swiss Catholic Missions for Prisoners of War, the American Red Cross, and many more sent books and full libraries to the American prisoners of war in Germany and Japan for the soldiers to read while imprisoned. And this was to boost the confidence and morale of the soldiers. There was an established library in most all prison camps in Germany. Also, they helped the soldiers by not only sending books, but they kept the families of the soldiers updated, they arranged the exchange of mail, and they helped the critically wounded soldiers when the German or Japanese would not. There was more than 1,800 volunteers for the Red Cross that helped the Americans.